Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Lawrence Palinkas from the University of Southern California, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the role of mixed methods in implementation research. And our second slide is one of presentation objectives. What I'm hoping to do today is describe some of the work that I've been engaged in over the last 5 years on three interrelated aspects of the implementation of evidence-based practices. One of those aspects having to do with the social networks of providers and the role that they play in EBP implementation. The second having to do with the kinds of exchanges between researchers and practitioners that occur during implementation and how they produce a transformation in the cultural systems of these two groups. And then thirdly, the use of research evidence and the role that it plays in the process of implementation as well. My background in doing this has generally been in three interrelated settings as well that I'll be discussing. Child welfare, especially child mental health, and juvenile justice. And then third, what I'm hoping to do is illustrate the use of mixed method designs in implementation through three particular projects that I've been engaged in that have examined each of these facets independently and relatedly within these three youth-serving contexts. Next slide. So what are mixed methods? And we'll start just with a broad overview since it's not really my intention to spend a lot of time talking about all the variations in designs of mixed methods, but I think it's important at least to communicate that mixed methods represent a specific method or approach to methods that focuses on collecting, analyzing, and bringing together or mixing both quantitative and qualitative data. And that can be done either in a single study or in a series of related studies on a common topic. The central premise of mixed methods is that using quantitative and qualitative approaches together provides a much better understanding of research problems than either approach is alone. Next slide. So you have to think about mixed methods in terms of the combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches. It's not merely parallel play in the sense that you assign somebody to do a quantitative study and somebody else to do a qualitative study and then call that mixed methods. They really have to interact or be integrated in one form or another. You can also think of mixed methods as both a model of as well as a model for interdisciplinary research. Now, many times people use mixed methods in implementation research to do two things either simultaneously or sequentially, and that is answer questions that explore a phenomena because there's very little theory or previous research to guide a direction, but also to confirm hypotheses generated from existing theories and to be able to, verify and generate theory in the same study. Next slide. As it pertains to implementation research, there are a number of reasons why one might use mixed methods. So, for instance, oftentimes quantitative methods are used to measure the intervention itself and the implementation outcomes, where the qualitative methods are often used to measure or evaluate the process of implementation. Secondly, qualitative methods, as I mentioned earlier, are often used to explore a phenomena and generate a conceptual model along with testable hypotheses, and then one uses the quantitative methods to confirm the validity of the model by testing those hypotheses. Third use is that the quantitative methods examine the intervention content, whereas the qualitative methods examine the context in which the intervention and its implementation take place. Fourth, the quantitative methods can incorporate the perspectives of the researcher, and really by focusing on a particular theoretical framework or set of hypotheses, that essentially is what it's doing, validating whether the research model is correct or not, real or not, whereas the qualitative methods are often used to gain the perspective of the people who are being studied. So collecting information on the perspectives of providers, of systems leaders, of clients or patients may be one use for qualitative methods. And then finally, no set of methods is completely without its limitations. And oftentimes mixed methods are used to balance the strengths and limitations of each set of methods by providing a better approach or more comprehensive approach when the two sets of methods are used together. Next slide. So I'm going to begin by talking about one particular study in which a mixed method approach was used. And this was a study funded through the William T. Grant Foundation that was intended to look at social networks and the role that these networks play in implementing evidence-based practices in public youth serving systems. Next slide. The reason for the focus on social networks is that there's been a lot of research on how important a role social networks play in behavioral and systems change in general. So if you think of for example, the theory of innovation by Everett Rogers, we know that the contacts that occur within organizations or within and between communities that are more interpersonal in nature, so the one-to-one kinds of interactions, are important influences on whether new behaviors get adopted and routinely used or not. We also know through work conducted by Tom Valenti at USC and his colleagues that the influence of trusted others within a network and having access and exposure to external information are both important influences on the rates of adoption of innovative practices. So we were interested in seeing whether the role that these networks play in motivating, adopting innovative practices or changes in behavior actually operate to facilitate the process of implementation by looking at how it operated within the context of an ongoing randomized controlled trial funded by NIMH to look at whether a particular implementation strategy known as community development teams were more effective than services as usual in scaling up the implementation of an evidence-based practice that's really designed to address mental and behavioral health problems of children in foster care. And this is known as multidimensional treatment in foster care, or MTFC. So MTFC is often used with youth who would otherwise be in congregate care, and they're placed in well-supported foster homes. The community development team approach was really developed by the California Institute of Mental Health to bring together key stakeholders representing systems, organizations, practitioners, and consumers, and then providing them with peer-to-peer exchanges. In other words, people who are at the similar stage of attempting to make decisions about whether to adopt new practices and exactly how to go about doing so. So what these, the CDTs provide is assistance with locally informed planning, including how to pay for these evidence-based practices, conducting a needs-benefit analysis, monitoring and support, a focus and training in fidelity to the evidence-based practice itself, and then finally technical assistance. So this particular RCT was known as an adaptive or rolling RCT, in which 40 counties in California and 11 counties in Ohio were randomized into two conditions, either the community development team approach or services as usual, which essentially means a system or an agency is interested in having their staff being trained in a particular evidence-based practice. They go to the treatment provider who provides them with training and various forms of technical assistance afterwards. In this study, these 51 counties were matched into 4 equivalent cohorts, and they were done so because not everybody could be trained simultaneously, so they were broken up into groups of 13 or 14 counties and then randomized into the two conditions. There was also a wait list feature that enabled some counties that were more prepared to participate in the trial to be placed earlier in the queue of randomization, or some counties that weren't quite ready to defer the randomization process. The specific aims of the social network study were really to look at the structure and operation, this is the next slide, of influence networks of public youth serving systems that participated in the first cohort, in other words, the first 12 counties of this CALO study, as it was called. We wanted to look at the influence of these networks on decisions relating to their participation in the study, particularly during the earliest phases, the pre-implementation and the implementation phases, and then look at the personal and contextual factors that influence the operation of these networks within the context of that study. Next slide, and this should be slide 10. What we did was travel throughout California, because the first cohort was all California counties, and interviewed 38 agency directors and senior administrators from these agencies. And as you can see from this slide, we got a very good response rate by county. Only one of the 13 original counties did not participate. And very good response rate within the counties, 84%. We then followed up those interviews with an invitation to participate in a web-based survey of social network structure. And 30 of the 38 people who were interviewed agreed to identify up to 10 people that they routinely go to for information and advice on how to use evidence-based practices. That ended up producing a network or collection of 176 individuals who were identified by these 30 participants. We looked at, in terms of how these networks were related to the implementation of MTFC by using a measure developed by Lisa Saldana and Patty Chamberlain and their colleagues at the Oregon Social Learning Center, known as the Stages of Implementation Completion, or SIC scale, to measure the progress made in implementation all the way from engagement, that very first phone contact, to sustainability of the intervention. Next slide, please. Now, what you see on this slide on the left-hand side is a representation of the social networks that were identified by those 30 participants. So there is a node, either a circle, a square, or a triangle for each of the 176 people who were identified. And as you can see from this, there is one huge connected network that it occurs beginning on the bottom left-hand side of that figure and extending through to the top right-hand side. And each of these represents people who are linked to one another within and between counties that were participating in this randomized trial. And as you can tell from this network, those individuals who had progressed further along in the process of implementation seem to be more likely a part of this one unified network. Now, apart from that network, as you look at the top half of that figure, particularly the top left half, there are a number of much smaller networks, some involving just 2 individuals, some involving 3, some involving 6 or 7. These are also networks that emerged from the analyses, but as you can tell, they were not as connected to the main network, and many of them, as you can tell from the gray shades, hadn't advanced very far in this process of implementation. Now, when we conducted analyses of the specific measures of social network structure, among those that we found to be statistically significant was the level of in-degree centrality within a network, the size of the county, and whether or not it was an urban county. So as you can imagine, being a large county means you have more access to more individuals. And the same is true of being in an urban county. But independent of that, the extent to which you had individuals in your network that others came to for information and advice was a significant independent predictor of the stage of implementation. And in a way, it makes sense. You imagine that people seeking information and advice want to go to counties that have successfully implemented a particular evidence-based practice. So the counties that they go to are likely to have these opinion makers or influence leaders that other people go to. Next slide, please. In this slide, you'll see 2 figures. The one on the left represents the social network that participated in the community development team. And the one on the right consists of 5 networks that participated in the control condition. Now, what's interesting about this is that all of those in the community development team condition belong to one centralized network. And if you look at the middle of that slide, you can see one individual that connects a number of the separate subnodes or subgroups of this network. Whereas in the control condition, you have one extended string of networks on the top right-hand side, and then 4 very small networks, one involving 2 individuals, one involving 3, one involving 4, and then one involving 8 individuals. The point of this analysis is that the community development team essentially accomplished what it set out to do, which was to bring people together and to build these networks. And as you can see, the network that was constructed through the community development team was much larger and with much greater linkages than the networks that existed in the control conditions. So what we learned from this study was that the stages of implementation were associated with the size of a county, its urbanicity, and the in-degree centrality of the networks. Secondly, that community development teams were associated with size and the structure of networks by having only one component versus the 5 separate components in the control condition. And they also exhibited greater in-degree centrality and betweenness, which is another measure of network structure than the control networks. These network characteristics were subsequently shown to be associated with the implementation outcomes in the sense that counties that were in the CDT condition ended up enrolling over twice the number of youth than those in the services as usual or independent condition. Next slide, please. We also learned from the qualitative data that we collected that systems leaders routinely develop and maintain networks of information and advice based on roles, responsibility, geography, and their friendship ties. And that social networking is central to the implementation of evidence-based practices through two particular mechanisms. One is acquiring information and advice related to evidence-based practices, and the second is the pooling of resources among agencies. So even in rural counties, it was not uncommon for systems leaders to partner with their counterparts in neighboring counties in order to implement an evidence-based practice. But ultimately, both of these mechanisms, acquiring information and advice and pooling resources, involve the collaboration between organizations. Next slide, please. So on slide 15, we have sort of a qualitative equivalent of a structural equation model that identifies certain groups of variables that are linked ultimately to the stage of implementation. Some of those variables fall within the category of outer context, a common term used in implementation models that describe things that are external to organizations that have an influence on the extent to which those organizations implement evidence-based practices. In this particular context, those characteristics included the availability of funding to support the implementation, a mandate imposed by a government agency, federal, state, or local to use a particular evidence-based practice, the size of the county, and whether or not the various agencies participating in implementation serve the same client. At the bottom half of that figure, you'll see the inner context, where three sets of characteristics seem to be associated with that context. And that included the intra-organizational culture that has been shown in many studies to influence implementation, success, and outcomes, but also an extra-organizational culture. And by that I mean the shared understandings that governed the goals, objectives, and the appropriate activities to achieve those goals and objectives that are shared by the different agencies that are collaboratively working to implement an evidence-based practice. And then with respect to the characteristics of individual actors, that may range everywhere from the role that one places in an organization to the number of years one has been delivering services to the experience that individuals have had with previous collaboration. These two sets of variables, the inner and outer context, in turn influence the characteristics of the collaboration itself. And by characteristics, I refer to whether the focus of the collaboration is on a very specific evidence-based practice or on meeting the needs of a particular client population in general, using a variety of different approaches. It may also relate to the formality of the collaboration, whether there's a memorandum of understanding, whether they see themselves as having to meet specific milestones, and then finally, the frequency of interaction, whether there is a kickoff meeting and then quarterly meetings or weekly meetings may also be influenced by the inner and outer context. These three sets of variables, in turn, seem to play a role in shaping the social networks of information and advice of systems leaders, which in turn, as I've shown you previously, influence the stage of implementation. So what we can conclude from this first study, next slide, and this is slide 16, is that successful implementation of evidence-based practices requires the consideration and utilization of existing social networks, of high-status systems leaders, that may cut across service organizations. So it's not only the networks within an organization, but the networks between organizations as well that operate to share information and resources. And then that leads us to the second study. Each of those circles, squares, triangles represents a single member of that network. And as you can see, most of the individuals, most of the 176 people that we identified are connected in one form or another to that one single network. But then you'll also notice at the top of that figure, there are some smaller networks that exist. And some of them, you know, at the very top left, you'll see a single individual. To the right of that, you'll see 2 individuals, and then some networks that only have 3 people, 4 people, 5 or 6. But it's that major network that I really want to focus on, because right at the heart of that network, you'll see a lot of arrows pointing to a single open square box, and sort of illustrates the key opinion leader who actually turned out to be a member of the California Institute of Mental Health, who was connected in one form or another with a number of the agencies that were participating in this study. On the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see a table that identifies some of the significant predictors of implementation that are associated with the network characteristics. So that, for example, the degree of in-degree centrality was a significant independent predictor of stage of implementation. And by this I mean that the more one was in a county where others came to you for information and advice, the more likely you were to have progressed further along in implementing MTFC. And that makes sense, because people typically want to go to somebody who has been successful at implementation in order to learn more about what to do and what not to do. Being in a large county and being in an urban county were also significant independent predictors of the pace of implementation as well. Next slide. Now, in this slide, you'll see 2 different networks, one labeled CDT on the left and one labeled control on the right. And the CDT network, you'll notice, is all one big grouping. Again, with connections to selected 1 or 2 individuals. Whereas on the right, what you see is one fairly large network that's a string of different smaller networks, and then 4 smaller isolated networks. The CDT condition, and what these results show is the development team basically did what it was supposed to do, which is to bring people together in an effort to collaborate in the scaling up of MTFC. Whereas in the control condition, where people, got information and advice as usual, the networks were much more isolated or separated from one another. So that in terms of the function of the community development teams as a way of networking and bringing people together, the results from this social network analysis seem to provide evidence that it actually does that. Next slide, please. So what did we learn from this? Well, we did learn that the stage of implementation was associated with size, urbanicity, but the interesting thing was the degree of in-degree centrality of these networks. So that, those counties that are ahead of the curve in the implementation process are more likely to be consulted for information and advice on evidence-based practices. Likewise, the community development teams were associated with the size and the structure of the influence networks. There were fewer components, only 1 group versus 5 separate or isolated groups in the control condition, much larger size and density, as well as a greater in-degree centrality in betweenness, another measure of network connectedness than in control networks. And these network characteristics, in turn, have been associated with the implementation outcomes, so that those counties in the CDT condition enrolled over twice the number of youth in addition to taking this data and quantifying it in a social network analysis, we also looked at the information that we gained from the qualitative interviews. And what we learned from that is that system leaders develop and maintain networks of information and advice based on their roles, you know, director, associate director, program manager, their level of responsibility, linking them together. For example, they may have grown up in the same community, gone to the same high school, and may even be related to one another for that matter. Social networking, we also learned, is central to implementing these evidence-based practices through two particular mechanisms. The first being the acquisition of information and advice that are related to evidence-based practices, but also through the pooling of resources among agencies. And then third, that both of those mechanisms involve collaboration between organizations, so that when you think of implementation of evidence-based practices, you really have to think beyond any one particular agency to the collection and collaboration of agencies that are engaged in this process. Next slide. So we were able to piece together sort of a model of inter-organizational implementation collaboration based on the qualitative data that we collected. And that model includes an outer context like the availability of funding to support the program, a government mandate that dictates agencies have to do it, the size of the county, and whether or not these different agencies serve the same clients. There's also an inner context that relates to the level of shared understandings that exist within an organization, but also between organizations. In other words, what their expectations are, what their priorities are, what their understandings are as to how best to meet the needs of their clients. In addition, the characteristics of individual actors, so people who have known one another, the number of years people have worked at a particular agency seems to be relevant. The level of training that individuals have may also be relevant in this context. These two contexts also appear to have some influence in the nature of the collaboration itself. So whether the focus is on implementing a particular intervention like MTFC or a series of interventions designed to meet the needs of a particular group of clients or population, how formal that collaboration is, you know, whether there's a memorandum of understanding or simply a handshake between the heads of two agencies who've known each other for a number of years, and then how frequently people work together, interact, you know, whether there are regularly scheduled meetings or scheduled as needed. These characteristics, in turn, seem to have an influence on the structure of the networks that link members of different social service agencies together, which in turn seems to have an influence on the stage of implementation. Next slide, please. So from this study, what we've learned is that, you know, to be successful in implementing evidence-based practice, you need to consider using existing social networks of high-status systems leaders that cut across service organizations and their geographic jurisdictions, and using them to share both information and resources. So those were, you know, some of the important things that we learned from that first study. The second study now was one that was done in a different setting. This was schools and community mental health clinics as part of a broader study that funded through the MacArthur Research Network on Youth Mental Health. John Weiss, who's now at Harvard, formerly at UCLA, was the PI of that study. And I was asked to take on the role of leading a component of that study that focused on dissemination and implementation of the evidence-based practices that were being used in this study. So the broader study, next slide please, the objectives of the broader study was really to compare the effectiveness of three approaches to treating depression, anxiety, and conduct disorders in 8 to 13-year-olds. So the three approaches were usual clinical care, what people are doing currently, a standard approach to using evidence-based practices that takes a manual and basically goes through that manual from start to finish in the order that's presented in the manual itself. And then the third option was to take a modular approach to that standard manualized treatment, whereas instead of following all of the modules in a treatment, to select only those that were most relevant or believed to be most appropriate to that particular child in that setting. Now, the modular approach was examined because, you know, typically in this population, you rarely see a child who only has depression or only has anxiety or only a conduct disorder, that oftentimes there are multiple issues that are going on with any one particular client. So that to take a single manual for depression or anxiety or conduct disorder may not be the most appropriate strategy for working with this child. Secondly, you know, problems shift during episodes of care. So assuming that you're going to deal with the next item on your list of the following week, may be confronted with the fact that the child comes in the midst of a family crisis, and you have to deal with the crisis before you can deal with that particular issue. A third reason is that clinicians just don't particularly care for the rigidity that goes into standard manualized evidence-based practices. So that oftentimes, even when they get trained, they will adapt them to the point where they're no longer as effective as they're supposed to be or as they were found to be when they were first tested. And so, you know, the modular approach essentially mirrors what clinicians do in practice, but it provides some kind of structure and logic for the decision-making that goes on in using that particular EBP. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you some of the results from the quantitative study of the randomized controlled trial evaluating these three different treatment conditions. And what you can see from that, and it's particularly evident from the figure at the bottom of that slide, is that post-treatment, everybody, regardless of treatment condition, got better. But those who were receiving a modular form of an evidence-based practice seemed to do best of all and significantly better than they were at pre-treatment. And that's not only evident in terms of the number of diagnoses, but it was also particularly evident in terms of the self-reported measures and measures as reported by both clinicians and parents with respect to the three conditions. So interestingly, the standard manual approach, you know, what we normally think of as an evidence-based practice, was really not any significantly different from usual care. But the modular approach was significantly better than both usual care and the standard manualized approach. Next slide, please. So the study that I was involved with, the dissemination implementation study, was designed to conduct both a process and an implementation evaluation of the two evidence-based practice variations in this project, and then look at characteristics of clinics that either facilitated or impeded dissemination and implementation of these practices. Next slide, please. So essentially what was done was a series of observations at the training sessions of the study participants, the clinicians in this case, visits to the clinics, and then conducting interviews with key informants as to, the conditions that motivated involvement in the study, that motivated use of these practices, but also perhaps stood in the way of the use of these practices as well. Then a series of semi-structured interviews were conducted with a number of the clinicians, the clinical supervisors and managers, as well as those who were involved in the research project itself, the CTP clinical supervisors who were monitoring the progress being made by the clinicians in the study agencies. Finally, at the end of the study, we did a number of focus groups with both the therapists and the clinical supervisors as a way of member checking. So once we were able to conduct a preliminary analysis of the data from the semi-structured interviews, we then presented it to a select number of these participants to basically confirm that our analysis was appropriate and spot on with respect to what we were finding corresponding to their own experiences. Next slide, please. What we were able to accomplish with all of this information was to generate a model of EVP implementation in randomized clinical effectiveness trials. And that model identified a series of themes which could be likened to variables or groups of variables if we would imagine this being a quantitative study. So there was one set of themes or variables that related to pre-implementation determinants, another to the short-term experiences of implementation, and then a third to the long-term experiences of implementation, finally leading to what ended up being the most sustainable aspect of this whole experience, which was a modularized version of the use of evidence-based practices. So I won't go into this in too much detail, other than to say that the three pre-implementation determinants related to the training opportunities, particularly the amount of time between being trained to do these evidence-based practices and the use with the first client, the number of clients that one had available to use these practices, second variable relating to how engaged clinicians were in terms of their motivation, enthusiasm, and commitment to participating. And then a third having to do with the fit between the client's background and the evidence-based practice itself. So that, for example, people with a more psychodynamic background were less enthusiastic about the practice than those who had more of a cognitive behavioral approach to treatment. The short-term implementation related to a series of interactions having to do with the first impressions of the clinician in using the practice, whether they were positive or negative, how confident the clinician was in using it as assessed by herself or himself, by the client, as well as by the researchers. How adaptable both the clinicians and the researchers were in terms of using these practices and making adjustments or accommodations to one another. And then finally, the degree of interactions that occurred between the clinicians and the researchers, both professionally and socially. In terms of the long-term implementation, we learned that Ongoing support by the researchers was absolutely essential to continuing to use these practices, and the support from the clinic itself, from the leadership, from its organizational culture, and from the existence of an advocate or broker for the implementation. Next, please. So we found that at the end of the study, actually 3 months after the study came to an end, that 93% of the therapists who participated in the study who were randomized to either evidence-based practice continued to use them, even though the study was no longer ongoing. And they came to accept the treatments after using them. They valued the interactions and support they got from the researchers. They liked the structure of the treatments, and they valued the evidence base for it. But interestingly, 93% of those who continue to use them in a modular fashion. So even if you were trained in the standard way of using evidence-based practices, you began to use them in a modular fashion. Next slide, please. Why was it successful? Well, we think the reason has to do with the nature of the interactions that occurred between the researchers and the practitioners. The association was viewed by the therapists with the researchers as a direct benefit for participating in the trial. Everybody loved the training and the supervision, and in fact, many of them thought the supervision was the best part. And the modular approach allowed for more negotiation between the researcher and the practitioner than the standard approach. And they both felt that they had license to do that, which increased the level of engagement and enthusiasm. So the notion of cultural exchange really relates to the fact that when people representing two different cultural systems, whether they're individuals from different ethnic groups or members of different organizations, coming together, that there is a transformation that occurs through that transaction of knowledge, attitudes, and practices that essentially produce a kind of alignment between a top-down approach to implementation and a bottom-up approach that dictates the need for implementation. And it's both a process and a product that occurs when people engage in debate and compromise. So I know my time is coming to an end, and I'm just briefly going to follow up with the last study that relates to the use of research evidence. And this was a study also funded through the William T. Grant Foundation and also occurred in the context of the California-Ohio randomized controlled study of community development teams. The focus on this particular study, next slide, has background at the top of it. Relates to an issue that the William T. Grant Foundation has long had on the use of research evidence. The fact that as researchers we generate so much of it, we really don't know how much of it is actually used, particularly in the context of implementation of evidence-based practice. So we assume that it's hard to do implementation unless you know the literature or have a reason for doing it and a way of doing it that's both grounded in research, but we don't know the extent to which that occurs. So whether policymakers gain access, evaluate, and apply research evidence in their decision-making and how they do so still remains largely unknown. So the study that was part of this project really to identify the factors that predict the use of that evidence and then prospectively determine whether the use predicts the stage of evidence-based practice implementation. Like the social network study, this involved a mixed method design where we first began with conducting individual interviews with a group of systems leaders participating in the California-Ohio RCT. And then using that information to develop two quantitative measures, the structured interview for evidence use, or SIEU, and the cultural exchange inventory, or CEI. We then administered these instruments in a web-based survey of 156 leaders of county child welfare systems, juvenile justice, mental health systems participating in the California-Ohio system. We also collected information from state-level systems leaders participating in another study that had to do with adopting guidelines for the use of psychotropic medications for children in child welfare systems, and leaders in other counties that had adopted MTFC but had not participated in the clinical trial. Next slide, please. So the SIEU has three major subscales: input, or where information comes from; process, or how it's evaluated; and output, or how it's applied. And as you can see from this scale, the input in turn has three subscales: whether information is acquired from other network members, whether it's acquired from experts at conferences and workshops, or whether it's acquired from documents or published materials like the internet. The process subscale also has three dimensions: the self-assessment of the validity and reliability of the information that's obtained, the self-assessment of the relevance, or the reliance on other people to tell the individual whether the information is valid and reliable. And then finally, the output measure, where people either use the evidence to make or support decisions that have already been made, or to ignore it altogether. And as you can see, the total scale had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.88. The subscale reliability was fairly good. We just published a paper that came out this week in Research on Social Work Practice that provides the psychosocial or psychometric properties, rather, of this scale. Next slide. I think I'll skip over that and get to the final element of this. Next slide. And that has to do with the consensus on the use of research evidence. So you'll see a slide that has a table on the right-hand side that identifies the SIC, or Stage of Implementation Completion Score, by the subscale scores of the structured interview for evidence use. And this measure was not simply individuals within counties, but rather clusters of individuals. So we wanted to look at whether it was more important to be part of a team that used or evaluated evidence in the same way, or whether it was more important to be part of a team that evaluated in different ways. And as you can see in the column that describes consensus scores, it turns out that the more or the less consensus there is in the team as to how to use research evidence, the greater the stage of implementation. And in fact, when we looked at the community development teams, we found that they were more engaged in evaluating research evidence for validity and reliability, and the consensus as measured by the variance scores was significantly greater in the community development team clusters than in the control group clusters. So what we learned from this is that, implementation requires effective partnerships and collaborations that exchange information and exchange resources through influence networks that are governed by the sharing of not the same understandings, but rather distributed understanding. So, in other words, it supports the validity of a model of culture and organizational culture that means not everybody has to be on the same page as much as everybody needs to have access to sources of information that collectively provide much greater ability to implement. than they would individually. So I think I'll finish there. I don't know if we have time. We've only got 4 minutes left, but again, I apologize for starting later than I expected.